IHSG merupakan pada perdagangan hari ini pada kalau kita lihat karena satu pekan terakhir pergerakan indeks perdagangan gabungan sudah menguat. Ya, Messi dan pemirsa, indeks harga saham gabungan sepanjang hari ini bergerak lemah karena ada aksi ambil untung dari para investor karena ada kekhawatiran terkait penyebaran pandemi COVID-19, terutama dengan adanya varian Omicron. Dan kalau kita lihat bersama pada penutupan hari ini, IHSG ditutup turun 0,71% di level 6.615 dengan trading value atau nilai transaksi pada mulai hari ini tercatat 11,2 triliun. Dan kalau kita lihat capital inflow yang masuk ke dalam negeri ini masih belum cukup tinggi. Dan di satu sisi memang ada kenaikan cukai rokok sebesar 12% pada tahun 2022. Ini menyebabkan emiten rokok hampir pada hari ini. Dan meskipun analis ini menilai masih lebih baik dibandingkan adanya kenaikan CHT pada tahun 2021 sebesar 12,5%. Dan untuk kita lihat bersama emiten rokok pada hari ini ada BPN tercatat turun 2,09%, HMSP ini juga turun 2,45%, dan juga WIIM turunnya 1,65%. Selain itu, ada sejumlah sentimen dari luar negeri, terutama pasar ini masih menunggu bagaimana The Fed yang akan melakukan kenaikan pada tanggal 14 dan juga 15 Desember 2021. Bagaimana para investor ini masih menunggu apakah The Fed akan mempercepat tapering off atau tidak, dan juga ada potensi melipat gandakan lanjutan tapering ini sehingga tapering akan dilakukan lebih cepat selesainya lebih cepat dibandingkan estimasi di bulan Juni 2022 mendatang. Karena kalau lebih cepat dan juga dinaik gandakan menjadi 30 miliar dolar Amerika Serikat per bulannya, diperkirakan akan selesai pada 4 bulan hingga 5 bulan ke depan. Kemudian tak hanya itu saja, kami juga mendapatkan informasi kalau Bank of Japan menawarkan suntikan dana yang besar ini untuk mengantisipasi kenaikan suku bunga dalam jangka pendek. Dan kami melihat bagaimana Bank of Japan menawarkan menggelontorkan 90 triliun miliar dolar ke pasar ini untuk pembelian obligasi pemerintah dalam waktu yang sementara. Kemudian ada penawaran yang pertama membeli obligasinya senilai 2 triliun yen untuk penyediaan dana segar. Kemudian di satu sisi BOJ akan membeli 7 triliun yen untuk menyuntikkan dana untuk periode pada tanggal 15 hingga tanggal 16 Desember 2021. Sehingga kalau kita melihat pergerakan bursa regional pada sore hari ini, pergerakannya cukup variatif. Kalau kita lihat bersama di K225 pada sore hari ini turun 0,73%. Kemudian ada Hang Seng yang turun 1,5% dan Straits Times naik 0,15%. Namun Maksi dan pemirsa, sebetulnya investor masih melakukan aksi pasang wait and see pada minggu ini karena melihat bagaimana ada 20 central bank yang akan melakukan rapat pada pekan ini. Namun yang paling ditunggu setidaknya ada 3 central bank. Yang pertama ini ada The Fed, kemudian ada European Central Bank dan juga Bank of England. Dan untuk pergerakan IHSG untuk esok hari diprediksi di level 6.595 hingga 6.690. Merci. Jessica, kalau kita lihat pergerakan IHSG melemah karena kekhawatiran Omicron dan juga saat ini masih banyak keputusan bank sentral yang ditunggu oleh para investor. Bagaimana pengaruhnya pada nilai tukar rupiah? Apakah pergerakannya cenderung menguat jelang penutupan perdagangan tadi, Jessica? Ya, Mercy dan pemirsa, kalau kita melihat pergerakan
satu aplikasi yang
I'm David Weston.
We've got the information and insights. David, you just hit the nail right on the head. From business's most influential and instrumental.
And that's the way you run good risk management.
But we need to invest in our systems.
Bloomberg Wall Street Week premieres Friday with replays all weekend on Bloomberg Television and Radio.
Welcome back to the Open, everyone. Good evening.
600, gaining 0.5%. Similar gains actually across the board with the CAC 40 for that. And the FTSE, all of that could change quickly depending on what we hear. It's the first day of the two-day meeting by the Fed, and we find out tomorrow what they're thinking. Now, central banks seem to be keen to bring down inflation. There are, of course, risks with the policy mistakes. So the biggest downside risk for stocks. And that's according to a Bloomberg survey of over 100 investors. Runaway inflation, economic experience, and geopolitical risks are also high on investors of markets. So Maria, quite minus multi-asset strategy statistics is more with us. And Maria, overall, you're pretty confident actually that equities will be on the rise, that I think central banks do the right thing, or at least it's already priced in. What's your number one concern into 2022?
I mean, actually, for me, I'm not very far off consensus thinking about a central bank, but I would probably phrase it less in kind of in terms of policy mistake, but in terms of market losing trust in central bank. Because what we have right now is kind of expectation that central banks will raise interest rates regularly, and it's not going to, but would go very far, and that wouldn't kind of frustrate longer-term prosperity. And when markets are losing trust in that, as I say, and when the Fed is making patient, the markets are not be patient, and then still pricing high rates, and that yield curve will steepen substantially and create different kind of economic and market. I think for me, it's market losing trust.
But so there's the trust factor, Maria, but also the divergence, arguably, between what we're going to see, likely, from the Fed versus the ECB, and potentially the BOE as well. What are the risks around that divergence, or the opportunities?
Yeah, I mean, definitely opportunity in kind of currency market. That's probably where this kind of dynamic will play most. I have to say for equity market, it's a little bit less, I mean, economies and companies are so interdependent. Say, like European companies, they actually perform, they're kind of more sensitive to what's happening in global economic demand and global growth, global interest rate, global policy than domestic policy. So I think that's really important, what happens with global policy if we're thinking about European or, I mean, UK stocks are obviously more global stocks will be happening. It's what happen to be very defensive, so kind of constructive outlook would have on the market, probably less kind of translates into the case.
I'm going to ask you, Ray, about UK stocks. Is there too much belief that actually something will be okay given what we're dealing with in Omicron, and that we still don't know exactly where the fault line on Brexit lies?
Yeah, no, I think definitely. Well, like the point I was trying to make is that, I mean, we know, I mean, those statistics were passed around quite a lot during Brexit period, that 75% of earnings of FTSE 100 companies actually made outside the EU. So what's happening everywhere else matters a lot for our life companies. But secondly, UK index is the most defensive index in MSCI globally, so it's we have more than a certain index like staples and healthcare companies and those real estate and financial. So those parts of the index are quite defensive. So our view is very constructive view of the market, dedicated to low interest rate. So you'll have a cyclical, more growth-oriented part of the market doing better. So UK will kind of jump up by default and probably underperform.
Okay, Maria, the China watchers will tell you that the pivot has changed in terms of the way positive next year. Is there an opportunity to be found in Chinese assets? Can we find shelter in Chinese assets as we way up in central bank and Omicron risks next year?
Yeah, no, that's a very interesting question, and for a long time we've been making the distinction between Chinese economy, which I mean increasingly being supported by domestic authorities, versus kind of Chinese stock market, which is dominated by the very large tech companies. And I think the distinction is important, and particularly like reading more recent kind of statements from China and kind of Chinese authorities, as a focus on stability, focus on economic prosperity is very, very important. I suspect that's not very kind of shareholder friendly for those kind of giant tech companies. However, it probably much friendlier for smaller, medium-sized companies that are kind of domestically oriented. So the way we're thinking about Chinese investment is focus maybe on domestic small caps versus mega caps. So maybe that trade has actually been very interesting, and it's kind of going directly to what kind of Chinese authorities trying to do to kind of increase prosperity for like product of prosperity opposed to channel it to mega caps. Yeah, kind of differentiating between small and large.
Multi-asset strategy set State Street with some really good price, not only in the UK but also how to play China. Coming up, UBS gets slapped with a $2 billion fine for money laundering. NatWest gets hit with a $350 million penalty as well. The details up next. This is Bloomberg.
Such an interesting new world.
The world is changing. For us, it's not about being first. It's about being the best.
While everyone is zigging, we're zagging.
We feel like we can maybe help people out more.
We have an enormous number of big ideas.
I don't think it's the great resignation. I think it's the great reshuffle, and people are reflecting on what do they want, and how do they want to work, and how do they want to live their life.
Adjust or not as a result of your green ambition?
We run a big survey around 32,000, more than 30,000 people took that. And as you say, there was a big gap between people that were worried about climate and people that were taking action.
Welcome back to the Open. We are 23 minutes into the European trading day. You're seeing green on the screen, gains of 0.5% across the benchmark European stock 600 basic resources. That is top of the list in terms of your sectors. That is driving the FTSE 100 higher by about 0.6% as well. Futures in the US also pointing to gains, slightly less bullish than what we're seeing here across Europe. 0.3% after that sell from the S&P. Particularly the Nasdaq on Wall Street yesterday. Let's switch focus then to the corporates, particularly the banking sector, and it is UBS that's been found guilty of helping to launder money for as many as 4,000 French clients to avoid paying taxes. $2 billion, that's less than half the levy the bank had originally faced back in 2019. UBS said it's reviewing all of its options, including a possible further appeal. Meanwhile, here in the UK, NatWest has been fined £265 million after pleading guilty to failing to prevent money laundering. Prosecutors said hundreds of thousands of pounds were couriered in black bin bags and branch vaults overflowed with cash notes. Okay, that's the fraud from NatWest according to the accusation. It's not very sophisticated, it seems. Let's get the details now with Bloomberg's Swiss banking reporter Marian Altenmeyer, who joins us from Zurich. Let's start with UBS then. What does it mean, the reduction in this fine by almost 50% for the Swiss bank?
So it's a bit of a relief because they were originally facing a 4.5 billion fine, and so it's definitely a slash in half for them. And you saw that in the shares; they did rally. This is something that has been bogging down the shares for the last few years. We've just been facing uncertainty of how much they're going to have to pay. The shares are now up trading around 17 francs per share. They were somehow share for the last few years.
Mary, what does the penalty actually mean for NatWest? It's a smaller scale, but it's also quite sharp.
So they've admitted that they didn't necessarily miss what was happening, they just mishandled what was happening. And so their admission of guilt helps lower their fine. What they've said is that they're going to be carrying the stigma of that fine, but they are able to pay for it through their provisioning and going to take a small extra provisioning in the fourth quarter.
Okay, great. Thank you for that roundup. That was Bloomberg's Swiss banking reporter Marianne Altemeyer on those fines for both UBS and NatWest. Coming up, we will discuss the tech dynamic environment in Europe. Part of that is fintech as well. Plenty more ahead. Stay with us. This is Bloomberg.
by this vaccination is able to potently neutralize the virus and a number of variants of concern. A lot of the vaccines being developed currently require super cold storage. One of the great advantages of our patch is that we're able to remove the cold chain. We've been able to stabilize the vaccine on the patch for at least a month at room temperature and a week at 40 degrees. So this makes logistically vaccine rollout a much simpler proposition, removing the cold chain from transport.
Equity capital markets in focus. Will speak to Anisha O'Shea of SocGen about the funding pipeline for European startups. Plus, the return of work from home. More banks tell staff to stay out of offices. Boris Johnson doesn't rule out tighter curbs. All of this, of course, comes as we get central banks with decisions this week, but it's really all about the Fed. It's maybe the Bank of England because they could surprise to the upside or downside.
Well, we get surprises from both, couldn't we, given the August total from both Jay Powell but also Andrew Bailey. We don't quite know where we stand with what some would characterise as the new unreliable boyfriend. Again, that tag being rolled out for Andrew Bailey. In previous weeks, at least, maybe that's unfair, but we'll see what happens later this week on Thursday. That is the Bank of England decision. The BOJ comes through on Friday. The handover from Asia and the US was negative, but nonetheless we're seeing gains across the European space of about 0.4%. How much of that is tied to an expectation that the ECB will have to remain supportive as Omicron becomes an ever more significant issue? Certainly here in the UK, Boris Johnson, Prime Minister, suggesting at least not and declining to rule out further restrictions as the NHS and the authorities here struggle with that variant. The FTSE 100 is gaining 0.5%. Part of that is the basic resources story, which is top of the list in terms of the sectors. The last time I looked on the back of gains from like iron ore. Gas prices also rising as well. The geopolitics around Ukraine, part of the factor. In terms of what's happening in Germany, 0.4% is the gain there. Software R-gain is lower though. That's one of the corporate stories in Germany on the back of some investment from Silver Lake. Over in France, gains 0.5% for 35 points. Let's switch it over and have a look at how things are playing out across the sectors. It was technology in the US that was in focus. NASDAQ lower, the S&P as well below that record, but the bet as well. The flattening yield curve, but as rates start to rise, we can get to